This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News. Texas has some of the worst air pollution in the United States. Houston and Dallas, where large oil refineries are concentrated, rank in the top 10 most polluted cities across the country. Within the past week, a coalition of environmental groups filed 5 lawsuits against the United States Environmental Protection Agency over the agency's Texas air pollution control permits, claiming they allow too much pollution and contain loopholes that effectively prevent enforcement. Washington, D.C.-based Environmental Integrity Project, which is leading the litigation, says that an analysis of state records from 2011 through 2016 revealed that industrial malfunctions and poor maintenance of facilities emitted more than 500 million pounds of pollutants, yet Texas failed to impose penalties on less than 3% of what amounted to nearly 25,000 illegal air pollution releases. With us to discuss the new lawsuits is Gabriel Clark-Leach, who is an attorney for the Texas office of the Environmental Integrity Project. Gabriel is a Clean Air Act attorney at the Environmental Integrity Project's Austin, Texas office, and his practice focuses on air permitting and compliance for coal-fired power plants and petrochemical facilities in Texas. Gabriel joins us from Austin today. Thanks for joining us on The Real News, Gabriel.
Thanks for having me, Dimitri.
So before we discuss the lawsuit, let's deal with this staggering number of 25,000 illegal air pollution incidents. Please tell us, who are the biggest offenders and what type of pollution are they emitting illegally?
So we were surprised to see that a lot of the air pollution, more than half of it in the last year was emitted by smaller oil and gas production facilities in the West Texas Permian Basin. And those emissions were primarily sulfur dioxide. And then we also saw the second highest concentration of illegal releases in 2016 were from petrochemical plants and refineries, most located in the Houston Ship Channel area.
And tell us about the 5 different lawsuits filed against the EPA. What relief do they seek? And broadly speaking, what is the legal basis of the plaintiff's claims?
Right, so these permits that we're challenging, they're called federal operating permits. And what they do is they compile requirements, all the federally enforceable requirements for the country's largest sources. And their purpose is just to ensure that the requirements that protect public health for these facilities are enforceable. And EPA's job is to oversee Texas's implementation of this permitting program. And EPA is aware that Texas isn't issuing permits that actually assure compliance and protect people. And in cases where that happens, the public has a right to petition EPA to object to these permits and to compel Texas to fix them. And so we filed 5 petitions on 5 different permits. In this case, or these cases, seek to compel EPA to respond to those permits because EPA isn't even bothering to answer, to grant or deny the petitions that we filed.
What are the loopholes or the principal loopholes in the law or the permits that allow these oil and gas companies and specific facilities to get away with polluting and without paying the requisite fines?
Well, so the issues that are the clearest violations, so we have one power plant, it's the Welsh power plant, and Texas has established uniform particulate matter, which is essentially soot. It's the gray smoke that comes from stacks, and it includes particles that are very dangerous. But Texas regulations establish a uniform standard necessary to assure, public safety. But the permit that Texas has issued has said that the Welsh power plant can blow past these limits whenever it is conducting a planned maintenance activity or a startup or shutdown. So it's creating a loophole to that rule that was established to protect public health. And then the second clearest example is that 2 of Baytown's, ExxonMobil's Baytown refineries and petrochemical plants, and those contain an exemption to major pre-construction permitting requirements for future refinery expansions. So while the law requires all projects that will result in a significant increase in actual emissions to go through stringent pollution control requirements and to offset new pollution with decreases from existing sources, these permits establish a basis for determining whether or not expansion projects are big enough to trigger these requirements. That essentially makes it impossible for Exxon to trigger them. They could double their refinery size, in some cases double emission of some pollutants without actually triggering these major source protections. And that's a source of serious concern.
Now, my understanding is that the federal standards for air pollution are, in theory, uniform across the United States. But my read on the plaintiff's claims is that effectively they're saying, implicitly or explicitly, that the standards are applied less rigorously in Texas and other parts of the country, and Texas industry is more or less getting a free ride relative to those parts of the country where industry is being obliged to comply with a more rigorous standard. Is that a fair characterization of the plaintiff's claims in this litigation?
So Texas has a federally approved program for issuing permits that establish emission limits for industrial sources based on the best available control technology. What these permits do is they fail to actually list the limits that apply to these sources. They include instead a string of inscrutable legal citations that don't really explain how the applicable requirements apply. And they don't require monitoring. So even if the limits were clear, in a lot of cases, there just isn't enough monitoring to know whether or not the sources are complying. So it's actually what you said is part of the problem, that the limits aren't strict enough. But the other part of the problem is even when limits are strict enough, you can't actually figure out what the limits are. And even when you can figure out what they are, you can't determine how they should be enforced or understand how these huge industrial sources are claiming to comply with these limits.
Now, as we all know, the Trump administration has put an enthusiastic supporter of the oil industry in charge of the EPA, Scott Pruitt. Both President Trump and Mr. Pruitt like to say that regulations, environmental regulations in particular, get in the way of doing business, and that these regulations are in effect job killers. What's your response to that critique?
Well, the interesting thing about this case is a lot of the requirements that we found are under-enforced in these permits we're challenging aren't necessarily the federal standards that were promulgated by EPA, but are actually permitting practices and standards that were issued by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, to reflect their understanding of the proper balance between environmental control and economic development. So what we have is a situation where Texas is not willing to even enforce its own standards consistently.
Now, if these loopholes were closed, if the law was being properly enforced in the state of Texas, what degree does your organization think that this would actually affect air quality in Texas? Would it, be noticeably, materially better, or would more rigorous enforcement of a weak law result in modest improvement at best in terms of air quality?
I think we could expect significant improvements, but it's hard to tell because with these permits, like the ones we're challenging, the monitoring is so vague and nebulous. You don't actually know how much pollution a lot of these sources are emitting. So we would expect that closer monitoring with more reliable techniques would lead to significant reductions. I mean, it would help these facilities identify leaks and save product from being, lost to the air. But it's hard to say exactly how much the improvement would be.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, what are some of the adverse health effects we're seeing from this air pollution in the state of Texas in particular? And, and one thing I'd like you to address is not just the adverse health effects, but the economic costs of dealing with these adverse health effects, because people like President Trump and Scott Pruitt, who complain about the cost of environmental regulation, don't often talk, if at all, about the other economic costs associated with a lack of regulation, and particularly the adverse health effects.
Right, and it is a serious problem. It's not just a problem, say, of people not being able to go to work, but it's a problem of children being absent from school and not being well enough to go out and interact with their friends. And you have conditions like asthma that are, you see much higher rates close to these industrial facilities, especially in the Houston Ship Channel. And instances of cancer, there are preliminary studies showing that they're much higher around the Houston Ship Channel near these large refineries and petrochemical sources than elsewhere in the state. So that's a big problem. But like you said, it's also a problem with adults being pulled out from work and children missing school, and then adults having to care for their children and not being able to do all the things that they need to do to live full and healthy lives.
This has been Dimitri Lascaris speaking to Gabriel Clark-Leach, a Clean Air Act attorney at the Environmental Integrity Project in Austin, Texas. Thanks very much for joining us, Gabriel.
Thanks, Dimitri.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News.